Hi, everybody. Sorry for a few minutes delay. I was just trying to get the um, other mentor, Dr. Ruth McAllister, as well, join us. But given the time constraint, I think I'll just get the things started while we try to get her on board. So in the next half of the session, we have three talks, very interesting talks. The first one by Mikhail. So I'll just start with Michaela to start the talk. So Ian, can we get Michaela's talk started? Yes, great. And then we will catch up in the Q&A session with Michaela. So welcome, Michaela.
My name is Michele Zadra. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Southampton, and today I would like to briefly introduce you to my PhD project. The provisional title is Online Political Participation Among EU Migrants, a Comparative Analysis of 4 English Cities. So I'm going to talk about the context of the research, the rationale, the research questions, and finally, a bit about the methodology. So this research is about EU migrants, because I am one of them. So it's an issue which is really important for me personally. Since 2004, so the expansion of the European Union to the Eastern European countries, more than 5 million people moved from within the EU to the UK for work reason. We know that because of the number of national insurance numbers requested by EU citizens is over 5 million in this period. Then after Brexit, the number of migrants from within the European Union decreased, and more actually European citizens decide to leave the UK, and so in 2019 we have minus 75% in the balance between incoming and outgoing European citizen, so which is the lowest number in total since 2004. And so to the point that this trend now since 2016 has been called on the print media Brexodus. According to the ONS, so the Office for National Statistics, in 2019 there were 3.6 million people, EU citizens, not born in the UK, living in the UK. All these people, they have electoral right, passive and active at local level, so which means they can vote and they can run for office at local level and at European elections. However, statistics shows that in average the voting turnout is 10% less than the British citizens, and the number of EU migrants that decide to run for office as a councillor or as a mayor is very, very low. So these are very rare occasions when this happens. On the other hand, in the last 40 years, all the traditional indicators of political participation have been declining across the Western world in general, but in particular in the UK. So I'm saying, voting turnout, party membership, trade union membership, they all went down considerably in the last 40 years, to the point that many scholars have called this phase as a crisis of legitimacy of liberal democracy because of this trend, negative trend in participation. Governments, all governments in the Western world, let's say, have tried to fight this negative trend by trying to engage in more citizens who are disengaged and give them more opportunities to be part of the policy-making process. To do that, they've devised different, alternative ways, alternative to the traditional ones, to participate, which are called democratic innovations. One of them, or possibly the most popular, is e-democracy, which was born in the 90s because of the rise of the web, and is the use of digital media to enhance citizen active participation in policy making. Initially, there was a lot of hype around e-democracy. Many experts and scholars thought that that could be actually the solution to the crisis of liberal democracy. And some even thought that actually could be a new way of a new sort of democracy, like a cyber direct democracy that could have took over the representative model that we actually have. This didn't happen, not at least to the extent that these people were imagining. So now, at the moment, there are mixed judgments about democracy, especially in terms of who actually is involved, who participates. So these two areas of interest together bring me to actually the problem that my research would address, which is actually the disenfranchisement of EU migrants, which is, we know it might happen because of they may lose the right to vote at local level, and after if the British government decides so after the end of the transition period. And also, we know rate is quite low in any case. We have seen, the turnout is very low at local election. Also, we can assume that probably is not even very high online, which is, an important alternative to offline participation. So if this is the case, so if EU migrants are not participating, we know they're not participating much offline, and they're also not participating much online, then they will be basically completely disenfranchised. So, and there will be a risk of political marginalization for them. This is a problem in two different ways. One is normative, so which means it comes from the democratic theory. So if part of the population is not involved at all in a democratic process, are democratic decisions still legitimate? That's an important question. A more practical issue, if a big community do not engage with the decision makers, the decision maker will not be able to listen to them, so their needs will be completely unmet. And this could, of course, create, in the first place, a political problem, but also a social and possibly also an economical problem. There's not much literature on these two matters together. So the lack of participation of EU migrants online, and since I think it's a very important issue, especially in because in light of Brexit, I decided it should be the focus of my PhD research. So the research questions that derive from this analysis of from this rationale are: what is the level of political participation of EU migrants expressed through online channels managed by English municipalities? And what are the determinants that explain the variation of online political participation of EU migrants across English municipalities? Sorry, there is a grammar mistake there. The methodology I would like to apply is comparative, but mostly qualitative. How can I operationalize online political participation? I will do that by using a proxy, and this proxy is being registered in an online citizen panel. So citizen panel are panels which happen online and are managed by local authorities, and one can register freely and on a voluntary basis, and then you get, is a tool that local authorities use to survey the population about specific issues and about plans they have for future policies, to know what they think about it, and on paper, on face value, to take into account what the feedback they get into in the formulation of these policies. And because the participation is based on is voluntary and to a citizen panel, and it can last in time until a person is a member until they decide not to be anymore, and is not linked to a specific issue. So it's is basically a manifestation of a genuine will to participate to engage with local politics, not linked to a specific problem, which can, I don't know, potholes in a street. Okay, but this is just someone who wants to be engaged, regardless of because this person will not know what the council want to hear from them. I will map them. So basically, I will count them because there are no official figures. We know they're quite popular, but exactly how many there are out there is not known. Then I will analyze the website of this council to try to understand what is the actual attitude of this council towards e-democracy. So in this case, online citizen panel, and also other tools like e-petition and e-consultation. And I will use both qualitative and quantitative criteria to assess that. Then I will try to quantify how many EU citizens actually take part into this citizen panel through official data when available. And if not, as it likely to be the case, I will do some online surveys and then try to get an estimate. I will survey online European migrants and try to understand how many of them actually take part to these are member of citizen panels. Then I will run small and comparative analysis, as in the title, for cities, which represent high level of participation of EU migrants in citizen panels and low level of the same type of participation, just exactly to have the possibility to compare and contrast, the different outcomes and try to understand what might be the reason for that. Other criteria might be the size of the EU community, which is the bigger the better. The geographical coverage of England, so possibly cities that are in different regions of the country, and then the political orientation of the council, which also has an impact on how e-democracy is designed and managed. As a method, the comparative method, I will use what is a method called causal process tracing, which is based not on quantitative analysis of independent and dependent variable, but on a combination of different causes, because that's, reality is very complex. So it's never a single reason, but there are many different explanation for a phenomenon, for a social phenomenon like this one, and that together concur to give actually the final outcome, but possibly looking for what is called a smoking gun. So some reason there may be actually
Thank you, Michele. It was a great talk. So we can open the floor for mentor feedback and followed by some Q&A with participants and the other attendees as well. So mentor, do you want to provide some feedback?
Do we have Ruth? No, not yet.
So Ruth is not yet here.
I literally have just joined. I missed probably 90% of that. I'm very sorry. I got held up on another call there.
Okay. No problem. So Deepa, you can go ahead first, and then we can let actually jump in.
Okay. Yeah. I think it was an interesting talk, but not in the area in which I can provide. Very useful feedback. But I think just broadly some comments. So you are looking at sources such as citizen panels and how people engage within that, right? So so would it also be useful to look at maybe so you might be engaging with certain online communities in sort of a passive way, like maybe just commenting here, there, and you could also there could be a whole spectrum of engagement, right? You could be asking questions, you could be raising issues that nobody has raised before. You could be, you could actually be doing. So there is a variation in that spectrum, isn't it? So maybe you can make use of some kind of. There are I understand that your PhD is not necessarily focused on the computational methods, but there could be some amount of NLP oriented methods that could be used to look at maybe how much people are taking part in argumentation or debates and so on, as against passively commenting about maybe, okay, well, there's a porthole in my locality and that kind of stuff, so constructive versus versus simply commenting, or maybe passive versus active, that kind of differentiation could potentially be you could maybe tease out some of those differences by using some NLP methods. That could be one potential angle that computational methods could feed into that picture. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for the comment. But the thing is, I think maybe from my presentation wasn't very clear. So that's something I should keep in mind for future presentation. When I talk about democratic innovations, and so e-democracy, more specifically, it's just government-led. So I'm not interested in bottom-up, okay, anything that's on social media. So I only look at government channels, okay? And first of all, because, you know, I'm only one human being, I only have 3 years. So, you know, you have to put some boundary, okay? Because just it could be completely another different PhD. And so I cannot do everything. So I you know, that's what my focus is on the government-led participatory online channels. And also because the actual definition of democratic innovation is, you know, the one I took from Smith is just include only form of participation which are put in place by institutions, not by citizens, for different reasons. Because, well, first of all, technically, whatever happens on, you know, on social media or which is not controlled by the government may have an impact, because depending on how much, you know, volume, how much noise it creates. But this is not a straight link between what happens online, you know, what happens on social media, what then actually becomes, you know, a policy or whatever. These channels then created by governments on face value, they are meant to gather, you know, to involve citizens into the policymaking process at different levels, from just listening to them to even actually giving them some decision power. And then, okay, it can be argued. There is literature about that. Actually, maybe it doesn't really happen as it is declared. But on face value, as I say, that's the thing. So there is a straight link between, you know, there should be at least between the input and the output. And so that's why for me, who I'm taking also, you know, I'm looking also at democratic issues at normative level, and so in terms of participation. So that's why it's very interesting for me to see to what extent EU citizens are in UK are involved in these channels, because technically that's what the council will be listening to when they're looking for, you know, input from citizens. So if EU citizens are not talking at all, they will be completely, you know, their input will be completely missed, and it may have the consequences, you know, in terms of policy making. So that's why I think your comment is very relevant, but it's a bit out of scope.
It's a bit away from
our research.
Your scope, yeah. Okay, and just a few more, very quick comments. I mean, one thing is there could reasonably be a chicken and egg problem with respect to electoral. I mean, participating in elections and candidatures, right? So if you have more candidates from that space, maybe if you have more EU migrants being among the candidates, maybe that would increase some participation among that community. So that could be one. Well, I mean, I think these things work both ways as well. And there are some of these new age democratic innovations, like you might have heard of participatory budgeting and things like that. So I'm not sure whether these things are popular in the UK, but I think well, those might not quite. Is it okay?
No, I mean there's. Yeah, they exist. It's not like they don't exist, but they're very popular in South America.
Yeah,
and other places as well. But actually, they were born, I think, in Brazil, in Porto Alegre. And I think in developing countries, maybe are more used than even in the US as well. I think they're used as well. But in the UK, as far as I know, but I know that the city I live in, Southampton, they tried. And I think it lasted like a couple of years or so. Like, you know, it didn't work really. But yeah, definitely, they are actually considered quite a good success. Actually, where they use it more extensively, like, you know, as I say, in South America, they're considered a successful story of democratic innovation. Although even there are some caveats, of course. But yeah, for me, I mean, and also they don't happen online a lot. Mostly still they're mostly presential, people gathering together. Because the point is like, especially in those countries in South America, not many people still have access to the internet. There are also a lot of issues, so that's why they're not, I think they're still mainly offline, although probably they also will take an online route at some point. That might be an interesting future spin-off of my research.
Indeed.
For this one, I'm not really, because UK, in England, local level, no, they're not very relevant.
Yeah, got it. Yeah. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Deepak and Kilim. I will let our other mentor jump in as well. Welcome, Ruth, formally. And I would like you to proceed with the questions, and then we can go to the audience. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, apologies because I missed 90% of your presentation because I got held up on something else. Can I ask, and forgive me because I obviously did miss this, the 4 English cities, how are you going to analyze the data? What's the process of analysis going to be? In terms of your approach, have you given that any consideration?
You put your finger in open wound, I guess.
Oh no!
I mean, data access. If I have to point one issue, there might be many issues with this project, but if I have to point to one, it's definitely data access. I mean, it's. I think English councils are not very, very good with these things, and also they're a bit protective. I mean, or they have also their reason. I'm not saying that's it's unreasonable, but. For instance, I mean, there are electoral data are bad. I mean, they're not centralized, so they don't go to, I don't know, to whatever they have to go in London. They stay local, and even local, everyone they take in a different way. So it's very. I mean, the number I have, they're actually based on estimate. They're not really based on actual electoral data. I mean, so yeah, that's a problem. I'm still optimistic that I might try to get something out of the council. So I asked them actually, for instance, well, I'm talking, what I'm looking into is like online participation. I know that when you register one of the citizen panel, they collect all sorts of personal data, and I would like to, if they give me some aggregate data about, for instance, the origin of the people, country of origin and stuff like this, that may be very helpful. But I know that this may not happen. I already quite asked some council, and they not all of them have them, or they're willing to share. So in alternative, I will have to try on my own to try to ask to do some online survey and try to. Again, it would be probably if you take a look from a statistical point of view, probably not really representative, I guess, but it would be there will be some indication that maybe can be expanded in future, because I'm it's just me, so I do what I can. But that's maybe an issue, and but it's, I mean, everybody works in this area have the same issues, and they still publish. So
yeah, have you received any indication of how easy it may be to access what data is available yet?
Yeah, and as I say, I already asked a few. Well, I didn't really ask all of them, but a few council that some of them are, for instance, Bristol, they're very good, and I maybe get something out of them. The problem is like they all ask, it's like they do every that's something particular, because for online participation, because electoral data, they're all the same, because elections. Council election are, they follow the same rules across the country, but these kind of things that every council decides to do it what they want, whatever they want, so they're not standardized at all. Even the same tool like citizen panel, they can be very different from town to town. And but the kind of information they ask when one registers, I register myself into like, I don't know, hundreds of them, I don't remember. So a lot of people asking me like, well, you live in Southampton, what do you want to know about what happened in Northumberland? I say, that's my job, and if you don't mind. And but they tend to ask the same things. But unfortunately, they ask about ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, a lot of demographics, but they do not ask about country of origin, not even nationality. Although nationality might be misleading because people change nationality. And so especially migrants, if they've been like, in a country for a while, they may then declare themselves as British, even if they've been born in another country. Country of origin is not a question they make. So ethnicity would be probably maybe the best proxy. If you consider that they gather together, like there's a British white and then non-British white. That's possibly the best proxy to EU migrants. Okay, you can always say not EU migrants are white, of course, but I would say most of them are. So you have to approximate. Unfortunately, the quality of the data is not good. So we deal with that. So
good luck.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. And
well, as I say paper which are published really on. So this makes me optimist, they can still publish out of this. Well, I was about to say rubbish, but I'm not going to say rubbish.
No. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, mentor, and thank you, Mikhail. Given the time limit, I'll just add this one last question to the question pool here, but you can limit your answer, Mikhail, in a few sentences, please. The question is about generalizability of your work, that to what extent can your work be applicable to other cities in UK and EU?
In UK, my aim is to make it, it's not a statistical analysis, So I will never claim like a generalizability, whatever, it can be absolutely generalizable, or whatever we say in English. There's an actual name for the method I'm using, which is causal process tracing, which is, I think, is possible generalizability or something like this, which means I get some insights, I get some ideas. They are representative. It's not just one, it's more than a case study. So it's not based on one, it's based on a small sample. But of course, at a country level, since the good thing about, councils is that they are very similar to each other. It's an homogeneous group in legal and administrative terms. So that's some consideration I can make. They can probably be extended to a certain extent to the whole country. But I will stop there. And I don't think they're extendable beyond UK, or actually beyond England, to be honest. That's why I say England, not UK. It'll be England. But then it could be interesting because out of the results, maybe you can do a comparable study in another country, and then you see if actually you can find a trend, some pattern that which, that can tell you that maybe there are, regardless of the country, maybe there are definitely some something in common that,
Great, thanks.
Did I answer the question? Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks, Michele. Given the time limit, we need to proceed to the next session as well. So let's virtually thank Michele for the talk as well.
Yeah, I clap myself. I'm very.
yes. All right, Michele. So
thank you for the question.
Thank you. And next we have Stefan.
Hello.
So Stefan, we can proceed with your session. So let's start with your talk.
Answer questions. So I look forward to the Q&A, and please do get in touch if you'd like to follow up on any of the points raised. Also, as this is a recorded presentation, I'll summarize the detail on each slide, and then you can review in your own time. So this presentation is about research into developing a natural language or NLP processing pipeline for conflict narrative detection. Motivating this research is the use of technology to explore humanity's relationship with violence. The North Star for this interest is the emerging field of peace tech that employs technology to assist with tackling the drivers of conflict, promote stability, and build peace. As a socio-technical discipline, therefore, this IPhD in web science has been an ideal forum for this research. and as someone who is developing code, and I find myself becoming a research software engineer. So guided by theories of violence from peace research, this research proposes a natural language NLP processing pipeline for conflict narrative detection. As we know, social volatility and the proliferation of web technologies has led to an increased awareness of online abuse. In response, a new field of hate speech detection has emerged that uses NLP to detect online abuse. A 2019 review by the Alan Turing Institute, however, finds that there are a number of challenges within this new field. So we seek to address some of these challenges by proposing conflict narrative detection as a new approach. So in this presentation, I'm going to take you through what we mean by detecting a conflict narrative using natural language processing. Now, by conflict narrative, we mean a narrative produced by an orator who intends to legitimize violence against another individual or group. Guiding the design of this NLP pipeline is the theory of cultural violence from peace research, which is a theory that seeks to explore the processes of violence legitimization. And pictured here is Johan Galtung, who is one of the pioneers of peace research and who first proposed the idea of cultural violence. So to define the process of detecting a conflict narrative, well, I'm going to show you a novel methodology for detecting and measuring cultural violence in a conflict narrative. And this methodology then provides a framework for the proposed NLP pipeline and for this PhD research. So we now begin by introducing the data set and problems with existing technologies. So as representations of conflict narratives, we created a data set comprising Hitler's Mein Kampf, along with political speeches from George Bush and Osama bin Laden during the War on Terror. In how we advocated for non-violence, Martin Luther King provides control data. As the slide states, we do not suggest any moral equivalence between each of these orators. Instead, we are exploring the functional equivalence in the use of language to legitimize violence. Each has successfully brought about dramatic change either through force or, in the case of Luther King, through non-violent means. Having such extremes in the dataset means we can assess experimental results through observation, since the moral colour of each text is accepted and we know who each were, or indeed were not, seeking to legitimise violence against. So having conducted a series of experiments on this NLP technologies, and I'll take you through the problems we seek to address, which seems to be an over-reliance on quantitative representations of language in NLP through methods such as sentiment analysis. So these 4 graphs show sentence-level sentiment profile for what we regard to be the most prominent text from each orator. We tested 3 sentiment analysis APIs for this experiment. The first is from TextBlob, which is a general purpose open source NLP pipeline. A state-of-the-art technologies, we then tested APIs from both Google and Watson. Whilst there is a wide range of technical complexity between these technologies, what we'll now see is that sophistication does not necessarily seem to determine a sociologically meaningful output for detecting sentiment. Firstly, consider the profile of both Bush's and bin Laden's texts in which they declare war. Both have similar sentiment profiles relative to positivity and negativity. However, the sentiment relative to how they were received would have been very different. Their supporters would receive them positively, and the detractors would receive them negatively. Moreover, transcripts of Bush's speech show how people applaud his statement. These APIs determine to be negative. Secondly, in a data set of extremes, we can see the profile for Mein Kampf is indistinguishable from the rest. So we might expect such an extremely harmful body of words to produce more stark results. Notably, if you look at the overall document scores, where Mein Kampf and I Have a Dream are extreme opposites in terms of sentiment, Watson and TextBlob determine them to be both positive, while Google determines them to be both negative. So when we're face to face, we might now discuss what these results mean, and inevitably there'll be disagreement. But then what is the framework that we use to moderate our differences in agreement? With much to discuss, I'll happily take questions in Q&A or in follow-up. What we might agree on for now is that for a data set comprising extremes of sentiment and APIs of extremes in terms of technical sophistication, what these results show is that there's ambiguity between each. So we're using the theory of cultural violence from Peace Research for developing the NLP pipeline with a focus on using qualitative methods that represent the patterns of language we use to legitimise violence. The theory of cultural violence was first proposed in the 1990 paper by Galtung. You can see the definition here. And for this presentation, I'd like you to focus on the aspects of culture that are used as a framework for interdisciplinarity. So cultural violence is part of a framework Galtung describes as the conflict triangle. Direct violence refers to physical acts of force, while structural violence refers to less visible experiences of harm derived from societal structures. Animating this conflict triangle is the data set, with acts of direct violence being through warfare. And for this research, we regard both jihad and the war on terror as examples of structural violence. Conceptually similar, each features the imposition of structural changes in society in favour of one group over another. So Galtung proposes that direct or structural violence are legitimised by changing the moral colour of an act from wrong to right, or at least acceptable, but through creating what he describes as a self-other gradient. The self-other gradient refers to how an orator may use each aspect of culture to elevate their chosen people, or the self, and those others deemed lower down the scale of worthiness. We will see what this means when we go discuss the methodology. And drawing upon social identity theory, we refer to the self as an orator's in-group and the other as their out-group, with the distance between each known as intergroup differentiation. What follows is a general hypothesis whereby the greater the differentiation between groups created by the self of the gradient, the more legitimate acts of violence against the out-group becomes. So as an established theory with precedents derived from across several academic disciplines, cultural violence provides a unifying idea for interdisciplinarity. As you can see, each aspect of culture relates to a different academic discipline. So the primary concern for this research is the use of language. And from the discipline of social psychology, I've already mentioned Tajfel and Turner. And in addition, we provide a novel perspective from Mike Martin, who seeks to explain the role of religion and ideology in group dynamics. And we use his research to create a schema for modelling group ideologies. Having now established the guiding idea, I'm now going to take you through the methodology we're proposing to detect cultural violence in natural language. And I'll begin by introducing a schema of ideologies. So for marking up concepts in a text, we've developed a theory-driven schema of group ideologies using the 5 group problems from Martin's Why We Fight as a framework. Martin argues that for any group of any size, they must resolve these 5 group problems for successful group living. And we use these problems as a theoretical framework to categorise synonymous concepts that represent aspects of culture for different group ideologies. To develop this schema, we coded Bush's and Bin Laden's dataset to categorise synonymous terms by each of these 5 group attributes. For example, the identity concept of enemy, synonymous with invader and occupier, is categorised by the military attribute of adversary. And we'll see more of how this schema works when we go through the methodology. So derived from the theory of cultural violence and led by the dataset, we propose the following 4-step methodology for detecting a conflict narrative by measuring the self of the gradient. Measuring this gradient means firstly marking up the linguistic representations of named entities, religion and ideology in a text by using both named entity and named concept recognition. The lexical relationship between each is then used to extract feature phrases containing both elevation and othering statements. And finally, these feature phrases become qualitative units of a measurement schema to infer the self of the gradient. So in summary, this methodology mimics the process of qualitative coding with a structured approach. And 4 steps provide this structure. And through a series of reproducible experiments, Spacey NLP provides the Python library to develop the pipeline components for each step. And all of these experiments are being made available as open source in a GitHub repository. So you can see the methodology in here with examples of the experiments we are conducting for its development. To detect the in-group and out-group of a text, we're using the lexical relationship between out-group terms from the group schema and named entities. Consider the following feature phrases from Bush's address to the joint sessions of Congress following the 9/11 attacks. As you can see from the dependency paths, the geopolitical outgroup term regime is positively associated with the named entity Taliban. And whilst we know that Al-Qaeda is an outgroup of Bush, there is no equivalent identifying term in this sentence. This second sentence identifies Al-Qaeda through its hypernymic relationship with terrorist organisation. Through the linking term known as, the outgroup noun phrase terrorist organisation is a hypernym or a categorical term for the named entity Al-Qaeda. So we have two methods for identifying the in-group and out-group of a text. The first is to identify relationships at the noun phrase level, and the second is through the use of hypermony with Hurst patterns. I'll happily take questions on what we mean by hypermony in Q&A or in follow-up to the presentation. Having detected the in-group and out-group of a narrative, we now look at identifying feature phrases that either elevate the in-group or other the out-group to create the self-other gradient. So for the elevation and othering, consider the following feature phrases and how they generalize using the group schema. So in this first phrase, look at how these named entities generalize to the concepts they represent. For this pattern, the deity could be any god people choose to follow. Still, the language pattern and intended sentiment remains consistent. So, and for this second phrase, here we can see how Bush elevates his in-group with the synonymous terms of benevolence. Here we can see how Bush others the Taliban by associating them with a criminal concept. And finally, we can see how Bush others Al-Qaeda by positively associating them with both benevolence and criminal ideologies. So by detecting the dependency relationship between named entities and concepts, we can determine which phrases elevate the in-group and other the out-group. Overall, notice how in what are declarations of war, beyond the use of military concept, Bush draws upon a range of ideologies to legitimize the war on terror. So also notice in using the schema to generalize each phrase, we are now detecting language patterns between concepts that can be used in context other than declarations of war. The instance of each named entity is less than critical to how the concept of a named entity relates to other concepts in language patterns. And finally, we have the scoring schema. So when an orator uses elevation and othering statements to create a self-other gradient, a scoring schema can be applied based on the severity of the ideological concept they invoke. Code in the dataset reveal the following ideologies. Now, the evocation of concepts from each of these ideologies create different senses of severity, and some of the terms after each of these named ideologies are some of the outgroup terms associated with each. Now, developing upon Martin's observation, the medical context is perhaps the most severe of these ideologies. He argues that where disease control is inherent to successful group membership, analogies of disease control can have a profound psychological impact. It is for this reason that describing people as vermin or terrorism as cancerous can be subconsciously compelling in legitimizing violence. And the evocation of this ideology features strongly in genocidal narratives. So the detail of this schema is some way off yet, but in contrast to sentiment, it is the presence and use of these ideologies that would distinguish pernicious texts such as Mein Kampf from the others. So we'll develop the schema using canonical texts such as genocidal narratives like Mein Kampf to determine the prominent features of these texts for scoring the self-other gradient in a conflict narrative. So stated at the start, in this presentation, rather than answer questions, I hope to have provoked them. I'll happily take those in the follow-up or in Q&A. And to the best of our knowledge, this research constitutes the first attempt to use cultural violence for designing and developing an NLP pipeline. And in addressing an over-reliance on quantitative methods, we attempt to distinguish this NLP research from others with the use of qualitative methods representing the patterns of language used to legitimize violence. As I hope you can see, in following the principles of web science, this research is guided by sociological theory for technical design. As such, this socio-technical approach supports and continues interdisciplinary research carried out within web science. And where peace tech aims to reduce violence, we support this aim by seeking to understand how violence is legitimised. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this research can be applied to web technologies in tackling online abuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was a great talk. So we'll start with the questions from the mentors and any feedback as well. So Ruth, do you want to start first, please?
Yeah, no problem. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed that. It's not particularly my area of expertise, so I just have a couple of questions to ask, if that's okay. So you say that this approach is more effective than sentiment analysis. Can I ask, have you looked specifically at any particular sentiment analysis off-the-shelf tools to make that assessment? And also, can I follow up with another question? Based on how you will apply this research, are you going to use it on, for example, live forums to test some of the principles as well?
Sorry, just had to start with a classic there of unmuting. So if you recall the graphs, I can happily pull those up on a screen share. So the 4 graphs that you saw were tests of Google, an API from Google that does sentiment analysis, an API from Watson, and an API from TextBlob. So TextBlob is general purpose, free to download, off-the-shelf technology. And then of course you got Watson and IBM, IBM's Watson and Google at the other end of the spectrum, which is obviously highly technically sophisticated. So analysed Mein Kampf, I Have a Dream, and then George Bush and Osama bin Laden's Declaration of War on Terror. So these are dramatically kind of violent texts, apart from, of course, Martin Luther King. And the point of those graphs is both Bush and bin Laden's were kind of similar in terms of positivity and negativity, which you might expect since they were both declarations of war. But the problem with sentiment analysis is you're trying to give a figure on how on what's basically a subjective view. So supporters of George Bush would receive it positively, whereas obviously his opponents would receive it negatively, and then the converse is true for Osama bin Laden. So that's the first problem of sentiment analysis, is that it's highly subjective. But then if you recall the bottom 2 graphs, basically regardless of technical sophistication, none of these technologies can distinguish Mein Kampf from I Have a Dream. And I've got a range of other tests as well. And there's a phrase in Mein Kampf that TextBlob scores as +1. So there is no higher score than +1 in terms of sentiment. And the phrase is, in this age of racial poisoning, any state that tends to the best racial elements of its society will surely become lords of the earth. So that's what TextBlob scores as +1. Now, both Google and Watson score that negatively, but then they have this other, what I think is an arbitrary measure called emotion, and they both give that a high score for joy. So you've got this kind of we know that, I mean, that phrase underpins racism, yet it's getting these kind of wildly different results depending on which technology you're asking. But there's no framework to assess what the answers you're actually giving. And if you notice from the graph, and maybe it's a point I should have made in the presentation, on the y-axis you've got what the y-axis is, and then you've got a unit of measurement, so a percentage, which is going through the document. Whereas on the x-axis, that is, but on the y-axis, what is the unit of measurement? What do you put in the brackets after sentiment analysis? I mean, this is just basic science. And then there's another phrase from I Have a Dream, which is, he says, it's something on the lines of, and I have a dream. So I have a dream, these are iconic statements. I mean, these resonate through time as positive sentiments. So, and that's difficult to argue against. So these should be getting wildly positive scores, but they're not. So it says, in I have a dream that in the dusty bowls of Alabama, with its kind of racial poison, etc., that black children will play alongside white children, and be happy. Now, you can probably predict what's coming, but black children get scored negatively compared to white children that gets scored neutrally.
Okay.
So I'm not yet, I'll happy doing discussion, but I'm not yet ready to commit this to words, but you've got to choose your words carefully now, particularly with everything that's going on at the moment with Black Lives Matter, is I don't think the algorithms are being racist, because I don't think algorithms have the agency to actually be racist. But the problem is that what we're probably looking at is algorithms that are permitting racism, but unbeknownst to us. But even then, if you take that then to the business case, a lot of these have been used to assess supply and demand for supply chains. So if you've got someone saying, puts on Twitter, I'm really looking forward to getting my new black BMW, that's going to get scored negatively, and which means you're going to have a reduction in black. You're not going to get a proper measure of supply for your black coloured BMW. So you've got both the moral issues, and then you've got the business issues as well that surround sort of the use of sentiment analysis. So yeah, so what I showed was a snippet in the presentation, but there's actually a lot more to go with that, which is on the GitHub repository, which has been made public, and you're very welcome to have a look at.
Okay, great, thank you. Perfect.
And you said you had a follow-up question.
Yeah, it was whether or not this has been tested in any live data. Have you tried to apply the algorithms anywhere on live data just now to test them?
Yeah, not yet. No. So this, I've tested it sort of manually. So one of the tenets of NLP research is to start with how you would do the analysis without the technology, and I think that's a good web science kind of approach. You forget computers exist for a moment, decide how you do it in the real world, which is why I'm trying to mimic qualitative coding. So I've done it manually in order to create the test data. And at the moment, I've only started to learn how to code 18 months ago, and you'll notice I'm of a certain vintage. So what's the thing that's holding me back at the moment is actually my ability to program in Python. But that's certainly where I'm going to be that's where we're heading to, which will be probably in the final year of the PhD. That will then be part of the thesis, which is looking at this whole range of data sets. I mean, the use case really is to the range of use cases. I'm part of them. I've been in the military for a long time, and you've got kind of conflict narrative analysis in the military, where you're trying to understand what are the grievances that might be driving conflict. This is a new industry now. So particularly around elections. So well, I mean that hardly needs any explanation here, particularly with the previous presentation. But you've got understanding what the underlying grievances are that are driving people towards action. That's one use case. Then you've got social media platforms. So a lot of them at the moment, they isolate the hateful message to one particular tweet or one particular post on Facebook. So what we're really saying is that we're looking at an event-based approach to detecting hate speech. But hate speech is a process. This is something that happens over time, and you get this kind of drip, 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 drip feed. So what we're looking at is, rather than an individual tweet, we're targeting individuals, kind of range of tweets as a body of text, rather than the individual tweet as an event, if you like. So we're looking at the process of violence legitimation rather than kind of as a single event. So those are two kind of those are business use case, and then kind of a government use case offhand. But I hope there'll be many more. Oh, and there's counter-radicalization as well. So understanding the processes people go through that take them from ordinary human being, if that's the correct phrase, to then becoming radicalized, and looking at seeing if there's a way to detect qualitatively what kind of processes they're going through. Again, looking at it as a process rather than a specific event.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to add to literature and policy around, the prevent agenda and what have you as well. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be the other government use case is the prevent agenda, which in the fullness of, I don't think I'd get to that by the end of the research. That'll probably be a postdoc, because this research is creating the pipeline. And that's taking quite a lot of effort with my novice programming skills. And but yeah, that's definitely where I'm kind of heading towards.
Yeah, I mean, well done to you, because I mean, regardless of your vintage, as you call it, to learn programming at any stage whenever you come from a non-technical background is really impressive. I had to do it a few years ago, and when it was Python that I started with as well. So I understand the pain that you're probably going through as well.
And I just have pink-haired teenagers running rings around me in their abilities. It's quite intimidating sometimes.
Yeah, but it's a learning process. So well done. It sounds like a really interesting piece of work. So
thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, mentor, and thank you, Steve. It's a fantastic discussion, in fact, as a feedback as well as your response, Steve. Is there anything else, Deepak, do you want to add in? If not, we can actually proceed with audience question here.
Okay, I think well, of course, it's outside my area of expertise, but I might as well make a small comment as a lay person. So, the NLP pipeline that you're using tries to look at the dichotomous nature of the narrative, and whether one of these classes is being put on a higher pedestal than the other, right? It's not making use of identifying the actual call for violence as such. I mean, that's my understanding, is correct?
Yeah, so that's something that so you've got a hostile narrative, which is something that creates that self or the gradient, and then you've got what I'm calling cultural violence, is when there's actually a call for action that's then placed within that gradient, if that makes sense. Okay. So we can be hostile to each other and sort of say, "Oh, I'm better than you," and that's the difference between, I think, between nationalism and patriotism. So patriotism, I mean, it's a good thing. Why shouldn't you be proud of who you are? But then it then steps into nationalism when being proud of who you are actually comes at a cost to somebody else. So I think that's hostile narrative. But then when it becomes cultural violence is when there's a call to action that then goes into that. So there are very obvious calls to actions within the data set. So and there are key words that kind of indicate what, or key phrases even, that indicate what the call to action might be. So we make the following demands on the Taliban. Osama bin Laden says the same thing. He says, we make the demands of America, and it's leave our country. And you've got these kind of very specific demands that are then put into that self or the gradient, if that makes sense. And actually probably a point to make is that when you begin to generalize to the conceptual level, it's actually surprising or not how similar a lot of these texts are. And even between, and I've got to choose my words carefully here, Martin Luther King and both Osama bin Laden call for people to boycott American goods. So they're both actually making the same call to action, which I think is very interesting. And again, I'm not suggesting moral equivalence between these people at any level, but I think it's interesting to find out what the similarities are between these the different points of the data set. So, yeah, so in answer to your question, you've got a hostile narrative, which is when you're creating the self of the gradients. Then it becomes cultural violence when there's actually a call to action that's placed within that gradient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my question leading up from that is that so there are other kinds of narratives which are not like violent, for not violent in the sense of like which you might want to differentiate from this. For example, during the colonial era, there were in India there was this Gandhian narrative which also had this two classes, and then a call for action which was about boycott. And then in these days there is a paternalistic narrative for aid. For example, the developed countries say that when we are further along the arrow of progress, the global south is much behind us. They haven't figured it out. So the call for action there is not violence. It's to give aid.
Yes.
So how would you? I mean, would this kind of a meta heuristic, which looks at two classes, putting one on a higher pedestal and then a call for action, would that identify all of these kinds of things? And would you want to differentiate these things?
That's a very good point, actually. That's not something I thought of, but actually that's almost that provides a good antithesis for what would be a hostile narrative or a conflict narrative. That would almost be hypothesis, thesis, antithesis, that would almost be kind of your reference point to what makes, to differentiate between good and bad. If I'm not getting too conceptual, that's actually a very good point. And I think that's why having Martin Luther King in the test data sets makes, because he advocated for non-violence, so that's one way of sort of providing a control data as a reference point. But then actually taking that further, which is looking at maybe kind of looking at sort of narratives of peace, if you like, and looking at peace agreements as maybe a data set. Actually, I have another way to sort of get these sort of thesis and antithesis are the debates in, I've downloaded some Hansard debates from UK government, which were about the advocating for the Syrian war. So you've got politicians arguing for violence, and you've got politicians arguing against violence. So you've got the thesis, antithesis, which I think is what you're saying. And there may be some more data within all of that I may be able to pick out. I haven't gone into that detail in detail yet, because I'm still stuck with the coding. But yeah, I think what you're making is a very good point, which is coming up with the antithesis of a conflict narrative means you've then got some kind of sort of almost a zero reference point that you can then make a metric from. So it's kind of the self-order gradient is a certain percentage away from what is then a reference point, which is defined by this particular data set.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
It might be an interesting exploration. I mean, but overall, yeah, I think the project itself is very interesting. I think it's a very unique angle that might not have been explored elsewhere in NLP. So yeah, I think good luck with it. It's very interesting.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, thank you, mentors, and thank you, Steve. Let's give a round of applause virtually for a great talk and great discussion in the feedback session as well. So we can move on to our last talk for the session before going to the panel of mentors. And that's, I think, all set up. So let's proceed with Raksha's presentation. It's not audible, Ian. Can you please check?
Question, which is titled Computational Model for Online Social Discourse. And this is the broader agenda of the talk. I will start with a small motivation and directly go into the proposed model. And then I'll talk about the specific research questions that we are addressing. And I'll present the preliminary results that we have got, and I'll end with the evaluation of the model. At this forum, I don't think I have to emphasize the importance of social media and explain the importance of understanding the social media. Social media has revolutionized multiple aspects of our society, for example, communication, networking, politics, religion, and so many other aspects. And one critical aspect that social media is impacting is the collective worldviews that are getting formed in the society. And social media has a critical role in formation of all these worldviews across the globe. And it is critical to understand what is the impact of social media on the social discourse. And that is where we come in to understand the online social discourse. And social discourse around any topic is the set of all collective worldviews around that topic. And social discourse has been getting formed, or has been there since the human history, and social media is now becoming a critical part of that social discourse, formation of the social discourse. And there are multiple research questions or research endeavors that are taking place already since the inception of social media, which look at different aspects of social media like user behavior modeling, information diffusion, topic modeling, and discourse modeling, etc. And these research questions have been addressed individually, and we are arguing that to understand the holistic impact or the larger impact of the social media on our cognition, on our thinking of the society, we need to understand the big picture or the macro picture of online social discourse around the topic. Consider an example. In the figure that is shown here, this shows all the social media activities for an example topic called climate change. And on social media, we can see multiple users expressing their opinion about the particular topic. By users, I mean it can be any particular one individual, or it can be a celebrity, it can be a media house, or it can be a government organization, etc. And each user can have multiple opinions. The arrows here represent the endorsement or likes or attention that one user is giving to the other user. And here we can see that there are multiple users who are expressing their opinion, and there are certain users who are getting more attention when compared to other users. And there are some users are forming a cluster, and some users like this are getting more attention from different clusters. And and there are multiple opinions. Like for example, this opinion here is saying, if you bring trash with you, take it back with you. And the another opinion is completely denying climate change and is saying that human beings are far bigger than climate change. And the third opinion here is saying that if we don't act today, it is our children might not have a planet to live. So if you just look at this topic like this on social media, it is very difficult to understand what is happening around the topic. Who are the individuals who are driving the topics? What are the stories that are getting formed on this social media? Our primary argument is that in a topic like this on social media, the social discourse around the topic is primarily driven by a small set of stories, which are called narratives. And these narratives are latent. They are inside the head, and they are not visible. And these are the shared worldviews, which are the driving force of the social discourse. And the multiple users in the topic play multiple roles. For example, one user might drive the whole discourse, one user might drive only one particular school of thought, which is one particular narrative, etc. And we represent a topic like this, climate change, in this form. On the left, we have the same figure that we saw earlier, but now there is much more details that are given. For example, there are 3 narratives that are identified, and each narrative has multiple users as participants. And each narrative has a narrative driver who has the most influence in the narrative and who is responsible for the opinions that are formed inside that narrative. And there are discourse drivers who are getting attention, or who are influencing conversations across multiple narratives. And these are the ones who keep the discussions engaging in the whole discourse. And these narratives are not independent of each other. They interact among each other. For example, if you see narrative 1 here is interacting with narrative 2 with a positive polarity, and narrative 1 and narrative 3 have a negative interaction. More details about the narratives themselves are shown in the figure on the right, where each narrative, for example, narrative 1, the hidden latent story or the worldview of narrative 1 is that climate change is now the biggest challenge. And each opinion in that narrative is actually an instantiation of this larger story. Similarly, narrative 2, the story is that every small step counts towards slowing down the climate change. And opinions are giving multiple ways of having our own small impact on the climate change. And the narrative 3 here is the story in the narrative 3 is that climate change is a myth, and the opinions here are completely denying the fact that there is any impact on climate because of humans. And naturally, if we see narrative 1 and narrative 2 have a positive interaction among themselves, because each of them are acknowledging the stories of each other, and they are giving different sides of the same story. And there is a negative interaction between narrative 1 and narrative 3 because they have slightly disagreeing or disagreeing opinions. And here we can see that there are discourse drivers who are driving these narratives. And as we have seen that most of the discourse drivers are either celebrities or media houses or politicians who actually express their opinion. And these opinions get interpreted in different perspectives, in different narratives. A story like this about a topic gives an overall perspective of the discourse around the topic. And this is the model that we are proposing, where the computational model for an online social discourse for a topic, yes, is basically consisting of these 6 fundamental units, where O represents set of all opinions in the discourse, and U represents set of all participants of the discourse, and N represents set of all narratives that drive the discourse. And this function gamma represents mapping between each opinion to a narrative. An opinion may or may not belong to a narrative, or an opinion can belong to multiple narratives as well. This function delta represents a mapping between user to discourse, and we identify multiple roles of users that are part of the discourse. And the last function, lambda, represents the health of the discourse. Health of the discourse is mapped to 3 parameters. One is the participation, which represents the user participation across different narratives in the discourse. Polarity represents the overall polarity of the discourse, and stability represents the stability of the discourse graph. For understanding the stability, we make use of multiple network stability models. So to realize this larger picture of proposing a computational model for online social discourse, we propose to undertake 3 particular research questions. And the naturally first research question is to first identify the latent narratives on social media. And we make use of a neural network model called RBM to understand or to identify the latent narratives on social media. And the second research question that we address is to identify the roles of different users. We identify 3 roles, which are opinion drivers, narrative drivers, and discourse drivers on social media. And narrative drivers and discourse drivers are identified based on their relative influence in the whole discourse. And finally, a third research question that we are now looking at is analyzing the health of an online social discourse. And as I said, we make use of multiple network stability models to analyze the health. So here I am presenting a result for a particular topic, and we chose Twitter as our social media platform, and we took the topic as Indian elections, which created a lot of discussions, controversies on social media. And this was between 2019 March to June, and the results were announced on 23rd May, and there were around 21,000 tweets that we took for the analysis. And the result of the model is shown in this figure on the left. And here we have identified 4 different narratives. Each circle is a narrative here. And we can see that narrative 1 is the story of narrative 1 is about predicting that elections are heading towards one particular direction, and one party called BJP is going to win this election hands down. And the narrative 3 is also kind of supporting BJP, and it is appealing people to support BJP. And the size of each narrative is approximately equal to the tweet share that the narrative has. And here we can see that narrative 1 and 3 have almost 60% of tweet share. Here we can see narrative 2, which is a neutral one, which is actually supporting or encouraging people to exercise their vote exercise the spirit of democracy, and it is stating the importance of voting. And there is the small narrative, which is narrative 4, which talks about negative impacts of the BJP, and we can see that this has only around 4% of the tweet share. So with with around 60% of the tweet share, tweets supporting BJP is the dominating narrative in this particular topic. And we can see that there are 4 discourse drivers who are identified, and most of them are news channels or public opinion companies or journalists, and so on. And each of the narrative has its own narrative driver. And here we can see that there is a neutral interaction between narrative 1 and 2. This represents the overall discourse around the topic Indian elections. A report card like this can give us a larger picture of a topic on social media and help us understand the macro effect or the impact of social media on the thinking process or the cognition of the society. Given that this is the kind of result that we have got, to the best of our knowledge, there are no models which actually model the social discourse around the topic, and to compare or to evaluate our model, we resort to human evaluators, and we analyze or we evaluate the coherence of the narratives by mapping tweets of narrative to their arguments. One question or one input that I need or I'm requesting from panelists here is to suggest evaluation metrics for a model like that we have proposed. This is one aspect where we are currently struggling to understand how do we evaluate a model, such a model that we have proposed. And I hope the panelists will be able to give us some directions to take forward. These are some of the references. Thank you for your time, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Riksha. This is a great talk, and we can hear feedback from the mentors. So I think we also have our third mentor here now. Is Suzanne here? I think she's joined us as well.
Yes, I am. I'm very sorry that I was a bit late, and I'm really sorry that I was...
No problem.
Your
And I think you had informed us about the class, so we all understand. Yeah, so we can start with the questions and feedback from the mentors. So Suzanne, Ruth, and Deepak, who wants to start first, please go ahead and start the phase for feedback and questions.
Okay, I'll start if that's okay. Thank you, Raksha, for a really interesting presentation. It sounds really, really valuable and interesting work. I have a couple of questions, and forgive me if they seem a little bit silly. Can you explain the difference, please, between the narrative and the discourse? The differences in the two expressions that were used in the presentation.
Okay. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. For a topic like the one that we took for an example, climate change, discourse is representation of all possible worldviews around that topic, whereas narrative is one particular direction. Narrative can be probably a subset of the discourse.
Okay.
So what we are saying is even at a topic like climate change, there can be multiple narratives that are emerging, but all of them belong to the discourse around the topic of climate change.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. And then just another question, where you have the clusters where people have clearly agreed with each other and had a discussion around a particular issue. How do you account for example, trolls and people who are being deliberately controversial to provoke a reaction? Has that been taken account of?
Okay. So we use natural language techniques to find people who actually belong to a particular narrative. So one drawback with natural language techniques is that it still cannot identify sarcasm or anything that is, if the intention is the other way around, it still cannot identify. But having said that, there can be, so that is legitimate, right? If somebody is wanting or somebody is campaigning against or for something, that is one particular narrative is what we are saying. We are not saying it is positive or negative, but we are saying this is one narrative that is emerging around that topic. So we are not going to judge the narrative, but we are going to say this is what is the narrative that is emerging.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I don't want to keep all the attention, so I'll let somebody else speak now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. Suzanne and Deepak, if you want to have any feedback, please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add some comments here. So one thing, Raksha, you were asking for some comments on what could be the health of a discourse, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't have expertise in this area, but I was just thinking aloud here that maybe the health of a discourse would be related to I mean, how well it is able to sustain different narratives during the course of the discourse. Like there is a temporal course as well, right? How well it is able to sustain narratives, and sometimes, I mean, if it turns out to be very, I mean, not so healthy a discourse, then maybe the smaller narratives would start to taper off. One would imagine, and also maybe things like, for example, flaming and trolling, which are there in usual social discourses, right? I mean, so flaming is like, I mean, you put very intentionally put something which is not related to it, but which takes the discussion on a different route, and trolling is basically some kind of personal attacks and so on. So those kinds of things, and how much they exist across these narratives is, especially narratives that disagree with each other, and how and whether they exist across these narratives could be an indication of health, is what I was thinking. And a couple of other points. So I was wondering how narratives relate to like other forms of NLP. For example, there is topic modeling, which you can use to model the topics across the discourse, and it seems like from the high level, narratives is could be thought of conceptually very related to topics, right? I mean, do you have any comments on that?
Typically, topic modeling would imply that you already know what are the topics that are coming out, right? But in a discourse like this, we don't know what are the narratives that are emerging out. So we are kind of,
by topic modeling, I meant the LDA and that kind of stuff. I mean, is that what I meant as well? The latent digital allocation.
Yeah.
Okay, but then you don't need to know the topics upfront, right? It's an unsupervised way of learning.
But even then, in natural language, so even in LDA, you would. So one technical issue that we faced with LDA was that LDA requires much bigger documents to be processed. Something like a textbook or Wikipedia pages. With tweets or with social media posts, it is very difficult to identify topics because they are very small. They are probably 2-3 sentences long, and each post is considered as a document, right? So it is very difficult to analyze what are the different topics in one particular tweet. So what we are saying is we are looking from the other way around. We are coming from the topic and then going top down to look at what are the tweets that are that have a common story.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And one final point, I mean, one thing that I was wondering, the specific context of the example that you pointed out with respect to Indian elections and so on. So, so having followed the event, I mean, I thought that a few of the narratives were kind of well, very conspicuously missing, like some hyper-nationalist narratives and some communal hate type narratives. Did you just edit it out just for the sake of the presentation, or was your technique unable to find it?
Yeah, some of them were specifically for the sake of presentation were edited out. And maybe, when I say this is a larger umbrella, right? When I say narrative one says there is no question about BJP winning, that actually includes a lot of things inside it. So that actually includes people who are trolling the opposite parties and all of them who are actually supporting BJP. So these are probably, so it depends on what level of or what granularity of narratives we are looking at. We were looking at the top level where we can say that, okay, this is in support of BJP or in opposition. So we did not go into much detail. Probably if you go and continuously break even narratives, probably it might be.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that. I mean, I think in general, the discourse and looking at the health of a discourse and seeing how democratic the discourse is and so on is quite an interesting research area to be working on, especially for these times. I think good luck with that. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deepak. Thank you, Raksha. I think given the time limit, I would close the session here, and then we start the mentor advising panel session where actually you can have even more opportunity to ask questions broadly. And yeah, so I think after that we will have, if you all want to continue engaging after the mentor advising panel session, you can do so for until like 15 minutes or so. Yeah, so that will be our plan for the rest of the session. So thanks again, Raksha. Let's give a round of applause virtually to Raksha as well for the talk and the discussion. So with this now, the next part and the final major part of the symposium today we have is the mentor advising panel session. And it's my a great pleasure to host this mentor advising panel session where we have three well-known researchers with extensive experience here who would be happy to answer questions that mentees have in general for not just like a research specific topic as well, but broadly the process of being and emerging as a researcher, a good researcher. And so you can ask questions to the mentors. So with this purpose, I would open the floor for the questions from the mentees. Any attendees who want to ask questions as well, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A, and we'll give you a chance also to ask the questions. So with that, let me first introduce and welcome our panelists here. And if you guys can see my screen. So we have Professor Suzanne Halford from Bristol University, expert in sociology, Professor Ruth McAllister, who is from Ulster University and expert in criminology. And we have Professor Deepak Padmanabhan from IIT Madras and Queen's University Belfast, and he's expert in computing. So we have this mix of experts in different parts of web science space. So let's start with the questionnaire, and welcome all the mentors. If you don't mind giving brief introductory remarks to the mentees, that would be great, all the mentors. So we can start with perhaps Suzanne from you.
Couldn't unmute myself for a moment then. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Susan Halford, University of Bristol, but for a very long time, University of Southampton, where I was one of the directors of the Centre for Doctoral Training in Web Science and also the Web Science Institute. I'm an organisational sociologist originally, and I've done a lot of research on digital innovation in organisations of one kind or another, but more recently, most of my research is working across sociology and computer science, particularly on what I would call the politics of digital data and infrastructures.
Thank you, Suzanne. Do you want to give any introductory remarks to the mentees as well?
I also forgot to unmute myself.
It's okay.
So much easier in person.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so my background is criminology, but a little bit like Susan, I have crossed the boundaries into computer science. So I specialize in cybercrime and undertake work around human trafficking, for example, and also cyber dependent crimes like hacking. I analyze online forums in Russia, and I also analyse forums in relation to Romanian trafficking to the UK. That's the two key projects that I'm involved in just now. I'm particularly interested in how people come together in online spaces, how they build rapport, for example, and then also how to implement preventative methods to help ameliorate cybercrime as such, and how that can help law enforcement by developing various software tools to help take some of the cumbersome nature of online investigation away from individuals whenever they investigate cybercrimes.
Thank you, Ruth. Sorry, I was again muted for myself. So yeah, I know it's an interesting experience, right? I think having an online version of the PhD Symposium. So with that, Deepak, do you want to say some introductory remarks as well, please?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm a lecturer in computer science at Queen's University in Belfast and an adjunct faculty member at IIT Madras. So my interests are in broadly in machine learning and data analytics, and well, in that space. But recently, over the last 1 to 1.5 years, I've been looking very closely and spending most of my time on the intersection of AI/ML and politics around maybe things around things around justice, fairness, and things under the broader umbrella of AI ethics. So that's what I mean. That's what makes web science a very interesting avenue for me to participate in. So previous to my academic job, I used to be a researcher at IBM Research for about 10 years. So before switching over to the academia, so I spent a lot of time in industry as well prior to this. So yeah, that's about it. So questions.
Thank you, Deepak. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Ruth. I think this is a great mix of panelists, and that's what we were looking for. My co-chair Mark is also there. So I would like to, so Mark, please feel free to jump in for the questions, organizing the questions session. I think we can start with the participants. Participants, do you want to start the questionnaire first? Any of the PhD students, and then we can also take up questions from the attendees, just for on your, not specific to just your research topic, but actually the process of being a good researcher and emerging as a good researcher. Please unmute yourself. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, Alison.
Hi, I was just wondering, I gave my presentation, and in my presentation I was discussing that I would like to use actor network theory to look at the human and non-human participants within my field of study, which is looking at, just for anyone who missed it, it's looking at the role that genre plays within music streaming services, Spotify specifically in this case. I was just wondering, even just an opinion really, because I've never really considered this until now, but it was how much agency can I really give from the actor network perspective to an algorithm if it was created by someone else who will have their own techniques and beliefs and all of those sort of things. How do you give something like that, I suppose, a fair judgment without knowing who its creator really was? Does that make sense, or have I gone too meta?
I guess that's possibly one for me. I don't. It's not a zero-sum game. You haven't got a pot full of agency that you have to decide how to distribute in what proportions to which actors. So that's the first thing to say. What
Okay.
you're looking at is the combination of actors and the combined effects that they achieve together. So the algorithm away, something's missing, right? Whoever created it, doesn't matter who the person is who created it, or people, not in terms, you know, whether they're called A, B, or C. It really doesn't matter. It matters that they're human actors working and who are creating a non-human actor, and that together the effects of those, the agency produces some kind of outcome. So I wouldn't get too hung up on trying to attribute, you know, 50% to this and 40% to that.
Yeah, I think I do have a
too hung up
tendency to get too hung up on the tiny things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's more the conceptual starting point, which is that it is the combination of human and non-human actors that produces effects. And so algorithms make a difference in the world. They, you know, they do something. It's recognizing that combination that's important. I would also say, Alison, it depends how wedded you are to actor network theory, but there's a variety of sort of social theories that deal with materiality that come with somewhat less of a baggage, maybe, than actor network theory does in terms of its kind of rigidity to some extent around how you use the concepts. And, you know, so I would think about that. I think I'd read a bit of Donna Haraway, to be honest, if I was you, and some of the new materialities literature, which, without wanting, you know, you don't want to go down a rabbit hole and read an enormous amount of things, but you might find it liberating to read some of those ideas coming not from actor network theory.
Perfect, thank you very much.
Great idea, by the way.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Steve here. I've got a question about sort of quantitative, qualitative data. So the project I'm doing is in response to what's an over-reliance on quantitative data, as I saw in the presentation. But ultimately, I'm using qualitative data, so sentences and the relationships between words, to ultimately still end up with a score of some description. So do you have any advice on sort of scoring qualitative data and without this ending up becoming then the problem I was seeking to resolve, if that's making sense? Or is there any kind of research on qualitative and quantitative metrics that is out there?
What's the problem you're trying to solve, Stephen?
So, it starts with sentiment analysis. So I can send you the presentation afterwards, Susan. I'd be delighted for your feedback. I analysed Mein Kampf, I Have a Dream, and then Declarations of War from George Bush and Osama bin Laden, and then ran open source and then Google and Watson sentiment analysis APIs over those to look at the sentiment profiles for each. And basically, regardless of technical sophistication, these profiles of what are kind of wildly different texts in terms of sentiment are indistinguishable from each other through sentiment, and even some of the APIs are actually scoring I Have a Dream as lower sentiment than Mein Kampf, which is pretty shocking. So when rather than taking a quantitative approach to sort of analysing text, I'm building NLP using qualitative methods, which you can do through kind of dependency parsing and everything else. And so the method kind of mimics qualitative coding, where you extract feature phrases depending on a certain set of criteria within that, and that's the lexical relationships between in-group and out-group terms, lots of kind of social psychology within that as well.
But what's the problem you're trying to resolve? The problem you're trying to resolve is that computational methods are not very good at understanding the emotional content. Is that?
Yeah, so ultimately the problem we're trying to solve is tackling, understanding conflict narratives. So understanding how to tackle online abuse, how to tackle things like radicalization. I've got a real strong interest in anti-slavery, as you know, Susan, actually, and probably relevant for Ruth. So looking at the processes that people go through to legitimize violence against other people and how to analyze that at scale qualitatively, but ultimately it's still, and to measure what's called the self-other gradient, so the distance between the in-group and the out-group. And ultimately that self-other gradient is going to be a score of qualitative data. So is there any kind of research about sort of scoring qualitative data that where you don't lose the meaning of what it actually means, if that's making sense? I don't think I'm making sense, am I?
I
Sorry.
find it quite hard to engage with the question, I have to say.
Yeah. So I mean, essentially, it goes back to the qualitative methods module from the MSc. It's going beyond that then to actually bring a blend of quantitative and qualitative methods. I think I'll withdraw from the question because I don't think I'm making sense.
But you're trying to improve computation analysis by getting it better at understanding emotion. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, through qualitative methods, basically.
And why are you so keen on maintaining this term qualitative and quantitative? Why is qualitative methods the answer?
So qualitative methods is what distinguishes the methodology. What the answer is actually the methodology itself. So it's distinguished from existing NLP methods by being qualitative rather than by being quantitative.
And what does qualitative bring to the party in that scenario?
So what it seeks to do is actually give a better representation of meaning derived from a text, and meaning probably gets a bit ambiguous. But it's where you've got kind of a sentiment score of +1 or a sentiment score of +4. What does that actually mean as a quantitative representation? Whereas if you can say qualitatively the outgroup is the Taliban and they are described as criminals and terrorists, then that's a more qualitative representation of the text I'm seeking to understand, if that makes sense. But ultimately, it's still going to end up with with some kind of scoring of that qualitative data.
So there's a long history of research on methodological debate about turning qualitative data into quantitative data.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can certainly point you at some references for that, if I've understood correctly what you're doing.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a big debate, you know, and certain qualitative researchers wouldn't like that at all, because they would say that you're kind of breaking the qualitative analysis by putting numbers on it. But nonetheless, people do it all the time. So there is a big debate on that. But I wonder if your question is slightly more complicated than that, and I'm missing the point. But I can certainly send you some stuff, Stephen.
Yeah, I think it is that simple. I'm sorry, I've got my daughter just in the room as well. If you can hear baby noises in the background, she's just brought back from nursery.
Nice.
So Steve, just quickly to add to that, I mean, there is within AI, there is a branch called qualitative reasoning, which is not so popular these days because it's been taken over by all these neural networks and so on. But the narrow domain. Well, I don't think they use the word qualitative in the sense that maybe I think they take some as computer scientists who are mostly accustomed to quantitative methods. I think they take a little bit of freedom with that definitions and so on. But I think there is some literature around qualitative reasoning and some literature around bridging between qualitative and quantitative reasoning in and symbolic reasoning, etc. Within the AI domain. I'm not sure whether it might be relevant to you, but just sort of mentioning that there is some. But
okay.
you know, I don't know how it can fit within the structure of the problem that you were describing. But I think it might be good to look at it nevertheless. If not today, maybe it might be useful later on.
That certainly, I'm going to look at that now. But that certainly fits in with objective 3, the methods qualitative reasoning. That definitely fits in with there. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Steve. I think we can move on to other questions as well. One question coming from the audience is, research results often seem to be exaggerated. Have you found an increase in such exaggeration in the last few years? And what's the biggest ethical dilemma that you have faced in your research? So I think we can go with the first question. Do you see an increase in the exaggeration of the research results? Like there is a lot more promise than actually the limitations associated with the results. And well, how to tackle that more meaningfully?
I think if I may, just a few, just something. I'm not sure I'm competent enough to address it to the fullest extent that the asker asked. But essentially, the crisis of reproducibility has been coming to the forefront in the last decade, right? And these days, with a lot of compute power, you can actually throw a lot of compute at the data and identify those kinds of correlations. And I mean, there are well-known things around like p-hacking and data dredging and so on, where you identify some correlations, and if you test enough number of possible candidates, you can identify something. And there have been very notorious stories around it. So I think the availability of compute and the ease of doing experiments and so on with a lot of these with a lot of EC programming languages, so to say. I mean, a lot of people find it very easy to start coding in Python and so on. And well, I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing, but essentially that's not at all a bad thing. But the availability of compute and the ability to do a lot of brute force search of a space has potentially led to a lot of issues with respect to that relate to like p-hacking, and so these are terms maybe some of you might be interested, might want to look up in detail. Data dredging and p-hacking, there are a few things which have caught on in the media, people having to resign due to having engaged in such practices, etc. So yeah, and the ethical dilemma, I think I would leave that to maybe Susan or Ruth, the second one.
Ruth and Suzanne, do you want to add in on that? Already?
Ruth, you go first, that's fine.
Okay, thanks. I like how the ethical dilemma question was passed on there. Yeah, I mean, obviously, in terms of cybercrime research, there are quite a few ethical dilemmas in terms of your identity as a person is one of the key issues. And also in relation to the modern slavery, human trafficking work that I have done as well in the past. There have been times, for example, where I have been able to manage to track down organised crime networks in the UK. And of course, in terms of research, I have been obliged to pass that information on to law enforcement, even as intelligence for them to act on it. But then, you know, there are ethical dilemmas around that information and what have you, and how I came across that. The reason why I had to do that was because I felt it was a safeguarding issue for a child. And that obviously took precedent in that respect. So ethically, it can be challenging. Equally, the kind of web forums that I look at, you know, information I may come across there is obviously compromising as well. But of course, everything that I do has to have ethical approval from my university, and they're very strict about those guidelines, and that information, of course, is passed on. Certain criminality would be passed on to relevant law enforcement agencies, but it's not a straightforward area to research. That's certainly one thing that I would say. It's very, very complex. I'm happy to answer anything else in relation to that also.
So Ruth, I think could you also give some advices on how to tackle it when we are dealing, especially in the cyberspace for the research, some of the ways that students could deal with when they're dealing with this ethics questions, which oftentimes people just don't, especially if they're coming from the computing background, not really paying much attention to these ethical challenges.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of online research, the ethics around that I find is sometimes a little bit slow to catch up with the reality of what cybercrime research actually is. Yes, of course, there are guidelines just now, but you know, certainly even within my own university, we're still trying to grapple with what the online space actually does represent. I think the important thing is, and I think a lot of student researchers don't actually think about their own position online and how that can be compromised as well, sometimes quite easily. So whenever I was doing one of my very first projects, my ethics application was rejected. And it was rejected because I hadn't given enough thought to my own online safety. And I think a lot of students don't necessarily think about that, because I think in person you think about experiences that you may be involved in, for example, or situations that may be slightly more dangerous, for example. But online, a lot of people think they're immune from any issues. In relation to the online research, I mean, I have created false personas, which of course is necessary. I take precautions in terms of the certain laptop that I will use as well, and everything has had the approval from the ethics department to make sure that what I'm doing is safe. And I talk about privacy, for example. What appears in an online space, is that granted the same level of privacy, for example. And of course I still do anonymize people's pseudonyms, avatars, that kind of thing as well, whenever I do write up any of the research findings. It is a complex area, and I think, like I say, we are still trying to grapple with that entire process of ethics online. I'm not sure if Susan maybe feels the same in that regard, or if she's different experiences.
Well, I do feel the same, and I think that fundamentally the ethics frameworks that we have, certainly in UK universities, have come from, they're based on a completely different data landscape. So they're based on a whole set of gold standards for how we should employ methods of informed consent and anonymity, and destroying data sets and locked filing cabinets, for heaven's sake, and all this kind of thing. And it's just premised on a different time. It's premised on a time where there were not the kinds of data that we're dealing with in web science. And so we're trying to retrofit a new kind of data into an old kind of data ethics framework, and that's really problematic. So I think we need a fundamentally different approach to ethics, and the worst thing would be to say, we throw it all out of the window, obviously, and that has happened. People have made arguments that the data we have are now so exciting we shouldn't worry about ethics. Well, I would say completely the opposite. But we need some new kinds of approaches to ethics. I've written a piece on this. I would be very happy to share it with you all. In fact, I wrote a piece that quoted some of the web science students, because when we first started web science, and one of the things we really found was that we were doing something very different, and we were getting really very different results from the ethics committees across the university. So the social sciences ethics committee was responding one way, which was generally you can't do that. And the computer science ethics committee was responding another way, which was generally, yeah, that data's in the public domain, that's fine. And so we were seeing real differences across our students. So I think things have moved on hugely since then.
Great, excellent suggestions. So any other questions, participating students and the attendees? Okay, if not, I have one question for the panel here. But first, again, any others to participating student has a question?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So this is in general about the situation that we are facing right now. Given that there are no movements of people across the world, how do you see research progressing? For example, if somebody wants to graduate now or looking for a postdoc positions, I don't think for a year or so nobody can even think of moving to some other place. What are your suggestions, and what do you think will happen, or how do you take it forward?
What happens, I had a new postdoc start her new job today, and we've never met physically, we've never been in the same place together, but she's Mexican actually, but she's living in London at the moment. So I mean, I think one problem is just how many jobs there will or won't be in higher education in the coming years, given the economic crisis and the pressure that universities are under. And that's the much bigger problem, is what kind of funding there will be for academic posts. But I think in terms of where there is funding and you're able to appoint somebody, then I see, it depends what area of research you're in, but I think practice is changing quite quickly, and if we want to make it work, there's various ways in which that can be done.
Oh, that's great.
This poor person has got a diary full of online meetings and a load of she's got to do. But I mean, and yeah, I'm interested to know what you think. But from my point of view, that's what I would have wanted if I was starting a new job under these really strange circumstances. You need to many people as possible and have really specific tasks and things you can achieve and get done and tick off. And so I think we're all having to think about how to make that work. But I think it's possible to make it work depending on what you're doing. I mean, obviously for people who need access to certain kind of laboratory environments, also that's a different question. I don't know if Ruth or Deepak, you have a thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, it's very, very similar. I think it depends specifically on the area of research. And if you do, for example, have to have access to secure data, where you maybe have to go on site, for example, to various places, and then maybe additional risk assessment, for example. I think, like Susan, this is a very new experience for all of us just now, and nobody really predicted what was going to happen. And I think we're still trying to work our way through it. But I think what we have learned in the last few months is that, you know, academics can do this online shenanigans, okay? You know, we've now become experts at Zoom and Teams and what have you. And actually, you know, in terms of employment, I think it's still very reasonable and feasible to do this work online, depending on the research itself. That's probably the critical thing, to be honest. And if it does require access to online sites, that's where it's slightly more problematic.
That's very encouraging. Thank you.
I think I mean one issue that a lot of my collaborators in India and the students have been facing is that some of them who have offers which require an international move cannot proceed because they need to move into a country to start and get some, like the equivalent of national insurance in the UK or PAN card in India and so on, to be able to start getting paid. So those kinds of things probably would we need to wait until this fast is over.
Yeah.
Right. Great. So I have one question basically that I was holding for all the student body in general, that if the panelists can give them advice on the way of doing multidisciplinary research, that's the core of web science really, that it just being from one discipline is not going to be sufficient enough to ask and really progress the core research and the knowledge for web science. So how can students excel in doing multidisciplinary research when they come from training from one specific discipline only? So for example, students coming from an undergrad computer science bachelor's, but they are doing a research for the online space, like in general web science in their PhD. So any thoughts on that?
Can I just jump in with my own personal experience here? I'm going to be the opposite. So I'm social science, that's my background. And I moved and transgressed across more to computer science in recent years. What did I do? I literally went to my computer science department and said, pretend I don't even know how to turn a computer on. I have to learn how to code. Teach me from the very beginning. And that was really challenging because I felt at the time there wasn't an awful lot of support. It was very much me who had to go and find this out for myself. But I wanted to as a student researcher, because then I could understand everything much better if I learnt myself from scratch. And following that, of course, you know, online classes, Coursera, Udemy, for example, you know, there's various ways. Even YouTube videos can be quite useful to kind of, you know, brush up. GitHub, various, you know, you can just ask questions and people are usually really quite helpful. But it is challenging because I think, you know, as undergrad students, we're very much positioned into our own little separate areas. And I guess, you know, certainly within social science, only in recent years that we've actually appreciated there's a whole ton of data online that we can access and utilize. But how do we do that better? Because your traditional methodologies will not work for a lot of this big data as such. So it is challenging, but I personally, I just went and pretended I hadn't a clue what I was doing with any technology and learnt from scratch. But it's hugely challenging, and I'd say it's probably the same for students who are students of computer science, trying to appreciate and analyse and think, you know, in a more social science discipline as well. So that's just my own experience.
Great. Other panelists want to comment on it for advising the students?
I mean, I think it depends on what opportunities come your way, doesn't it? So when we set up the Web Science PhD program, we had the luxury of having a master's year, in which we just insisted on students learning a variety of skills from outside of their comfort. They're all nodding and looking kind of slightly rueful about it. learning things that were outside their comfort zone, and we designed it that way so that the computer scientists who came out of undergraduate degrees had to read actor network theory, and the social scientists who came out of sociology degrees had to do semantic web technologies. And we weren't creating computer scientists out of social scientists or vice versa, but we were trying to open up some worlds for people that they would be able to at least develop some basic literacy in. And then obviously once you've done that, you can start to develop your expertise much more through being co-supervised by people from different disciplines. So, you know, I think although it was tough for students doing that master's program, and, you know, Mark knows more than I do, having been there for every single cohort for, gosh, 12 years, is it, Mark? Something like that. You know, Mark used to have a box of tissues in his office that was labelled with the course codes for one of our courses, because so many students used to go in there and cry about this course. So, you know, it was really difficult, but it was also a real luxury compared with what Ruth's describing, where, you know, you had to go and do it on your own and you had to figure it out on your own. And I think the opportunity to do that as part of a cohort where largely students supported each other across different disciplines and kind of clung on to each other in order to be successful in the group work and so on. That was a real opportunity. I
would have loved that. I'm quite jealous.
Well, you've got several people here who went through it. I don't know if they loved it, but
I think one of the experiences I had of that course and being of a certain vintage is not just learning about new ideas, but it's actually unlearning stuff that I'd been surviving on for a number of years. So it's actually a process of unlearning and questioning yourself and questioning what you believe to be true in order to then create the mental space to actually learn new ideas.
I would definitely say the age part aside, like, I think our entire cohort, like, we definitely got put through it, regardless, because of the backgrounds that we all came from. Like, for example, I'm from a music background, so I was learning the coding and the sociology stuff, really. So it was definitely such a great experience to be able to then be able to go and move into the PhD and feel a bit more confident in where to look for the answers and things like that.
I think on interdisciplinarity, if I may just add something. Coming from a computer science background and only recently started working on interdisciplinary topics, I mean, I found one thing to be, to be particularly concerning of computer science students coming into this thing, and especially in AI students. There's a lot of math snobbery, as I call it, around, where you just try and use AI to do a lot of new kinds of addressing a lot of new kinds of problems. Some of them are yield specified. For example, there was a paper a couple of years back, I think, which is looking at predicting criminality from the face. So you give images of face, and you're trying to predict that. So there's a lot of I mean, especially for people coming from computer science and working in interdisciplinary areas, there is a lot of cases where you don't give enough respect to the other area. You don't get to understand the other area. So that has been particularly concerning, especially, and leading to a lot of papers that needed to be retracted and so on and so forth. And I think interdisciplinary work in this space, in the area of, like, maybe intersection of AI and other and more of social sciences, etc., is particularly useful in terms of being able to do substantive. Well, if you want to be an expert in AI, it's quite hard. It's a very competitive space, and I think Hemant would agree that in computer science, but with deep learning and so on, there's massive competition around. So this opens up a fertile, working in the intersection opens up a fertile ground of new problems which you can address as the first. Which has not been addressed so far, etc. That kind of thing is very useful, and it can be known in a space in the intersection, and well, a lot more people could live in the intersection rather than being leaders in a particular space and so on. And I think my own I started working on this related to AI and politics just in the last 1.5 years. So it took a lot of time. I spent like 3 to 4 months just reading books and so on, political philosophy and so on. So it was a very unproductive year with respect to the number of publications and so on. But I think it was worth it eventually at the end of it. So it's some parts of the journey are probably very well unrewarding in the short run, but maybe much more rewarding in the long run. So it's probably just. That's all I had to say.
Great. I think great suggestions and ideas, panelists. Like there are formal ways, like taking the classes, and then there are informal ways through the means of online resources and actually the books as well to actually get acquainted with those. Yes, but I think I certainly feel that for field like web science, if we have to nurture students who are really at the intersection, they need to have like both sides, and I think the suggestions you're giving are valuable fully to get them to their end goal. And so with that, I would just suggest any last remark points from the mentors because we are really at the end of the symposium session. So any last remarks from the mentors for the students?
I'd just say really have confidence in what you're doing by combining disciplines. It is really hard, it is challenging, but you're creating something that's completely new, so you should have confidence in it. And one thing I would say, and Mark will put me right on the facts, but when we look at the destinations of our graduates from the PhD program in web science at Southampton, they're very, very much in demand. So although every year there's some kind of somebody will say, oh, who's going to want to give jobs to people who've got this, who's reaching across the disciplines? And we find the opposite. We find people being headhunted. We find a really high number of people going into academic posts, much higher than is the case nationally. And so these kinds of skills that you're growing by being brave and facing all of that trauma of having to step outside of your comfort zone, they're skills that are really, really in demand. So have confidence in what you're doing would be my message.
I would echo what Susan just said there. To have someone who can think in a technical manner and also socially is really highly valued within the employment market. There's no question about that. More and more people do look for those skill sets. And I guess in relation to your research itself, enjoy the journey. There are sometimes I'm sure you want to maybe pull your hair out and like just buying laptops and various things, but really enjoy. It's a privilege, I think, to be able to study what it is that you are doing. And I know it's incredibly stressful and it feels like a massive windy mountain, but you will look back and actually enjoy the experience as well. So definitely, keep at it and good luck for getting this far also. You are all doing really exciting work.
I don't think I have anything much to add to those two very, very nice narratives from Susan and Ruth. I think, yeah, we listened to a number of great talks, and it's good to see a lot of activity happening in these kinds of areas, which are the intersection of computing and social sciences. So, yeah, hopefully we'll see this area flourishing going forward, and all of you would have great careers, I think.
Right, these are the ambassadors, right? Absolutely. So thank you all the mentors, and thank you all the participants. This was, I think, great, really good session looking at the new thing, basically new directions for research that you all are championing, and hopefully you benefited from the mentors' advices. I think the message directly to the students, and attendees for sharing questions, like good questions, asking good questions. And yeah, that's with that, I would let Mark, my co-chair, actually formally close the session. Mark, please go ahead.
Okay, and thank you very much, Hemant, for chairing the sessions today. I think you've done a fantastic job, and we've kicked the conference off in a fantastic way. I think at one point there was about 30 people in the PhD Symposium, which is better attended than any I've been to it face to face. So perhaps there are a few small advantages to this online world. And well done, everybody. Really enjoyed those presentations. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I think there's some fantastic panels and sessions coming up this week. And thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have great rest of the evening, night, and day now, because it's online. So we are all across the globe. So yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Nice to see everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.